So we have discussed the factors, that are responsible for the degradation. Next, we need to look at the impacts these factors usually have, on the environment. All the factors that we mentioned. Number one, ecological and environmental impacts. What are the ecological and environmental impacts that all of these factors that we discuss have? Most notoriously, oil spills. Of course, we discuss acid rain that comes from gas flaring, toxic waste that comes from decimated, mangrove forests, which are critical to nurseries for fishes. The mangrove forest there is very critical to the fishing industry, but because all of this is completely eroded and destroyed by the oil spills that we looked at, it becomes impossible for the fishing industry to be able to benefit, from those water bodies any longer. The rivers become polluted, the creeks, and there's a very serious loss of biodiversity within this ecosystem because of these oil spills and flares and so on and so forth. Now, apart from that, other ecological environmental impacts have to do with the land. Like I said, the land becomes degraded, the soil becomes degraded, you can't plant. Okay, the spills and the sludge render the farmland infertile, poisoning the soil and the groundwater. So that means extracting water from the ground, like we have here. You have boreholes from which you can get subterranean water to drink. That becomes, it's out of the point. Why? Because of the oil spill. So they cannot be able to begin to, sink boreholes that unless the boreholes are really, really deep, So it becomes very expensive getting fresh water. This reduces agricultural, activity, and by reducing agricultural activity, you are reducing food production, capacity for food production. So that affects the whole population as a whole. Now, apart from that, there's air pollution and there's an impact on the climate. Constant gas flaring that releases a lot of CO2, methane, and so on and so forth into the atmosphere. It affects. Remember, we said that the atmosphere is a global common. So it's not just affecting the people in the Niger Delta, it's affecting people all over the world within the environment. So the loss of biodiversity, they affect the pollution of the air. When I say biodiversity, I mean the flora and fauna within that ecosystem, plants, animals, insects, everything that makes up the food chain, okay, that sustains life within that ecosystem is completely damaged. This is critical. Okay, so another impact is on the human health. That means the quality of health of people living in that environment is completely affected, is degraded because of the toxicity of the air that they are breathing, the compromised veracity of the food that they are going to eat. Because no matter how, even the areas that are not affected somehow because of the polluted air, they will be affected. So the quality of food that they're eating in that community is also affected. Communities are exposed to carcinogens like benzene, polycyclic, aromatic hydrocarbons, all kinds of chemicals that cause cancer. When you say carcinogens, we mean chemicals that cause cancer. So all of this, that are released into the atmosphere, the air, the water, the food, this leads to elevated risk of cancer and respiratory, diseases, and also skin disorders. So all these diseases, especially the ones that are waterborne, they can affect the, let's say, the mortality rate of the people in that particular area. That means how long they live, or how many people die within a period of time. So that means the longevity of the people living in that area is affected because of all these factors that I've just mentioned now. Basically, the environmental degradation is cutting their lifespan shorter because of exposure to all of these diseases, waterborne diseases, landborne. Now, reproductive and developmental issues can also come in Because when some of these things enter into the human body, it can affect fertility, it can affect miscarriages, it can affect child development, and in many cases, it is also linked to long-term exposure, to all of this oil-related pollution. It affects malnutrition of children because the collapse of local food systems, result into a situation whereby there's not proper nutritious food for children, and both children and adults to eat in that area. So this myriad of problems, impact on human health. Ones that I've just mentioned now, the impact on human health to a very good extent, thereby reducing the lifespan of the people who live in this particular area. So impact number 3, socioeconomic and livelihood impact. Socioeconomic and livelihood. There's a collapse of traditional livelihood. Okay, the jobs that people do traditionally, farming and the fishing, which are the mainstay of the economy there, has more or less collapsed because there is no fish for you to get from the rivers and the creeks, because all of them have died as a result of oil spillage. The crabs, the shrimp, snails, all the other forms of food that you get from this ecosystem, have completely, been eradicated. So the livelihood of these people who are the fishers and the farmers, is basically eroded. So that means if their livelihood is eroded, that means there's low income. It will result into low income. If a fisherman used to be able to catch 3 baskets of fishes prior to this degradative effect of oil spills, now he's able to catch only 1 basket. Now you can see that how that affects his income, and that it definitely affects the family. Remember, we're looking at socioeconomic livelihood impact. It affects his capacity to take care of his family, and by extension, it affects the extended family also. People have a lot of dependents that depend on them, for this livelihood. So on the whole, it affects the entire economy. It affects the economy of, these ecosystems that we're talking about. They are not able to generate enough money, income, inside of that economy. So that means it raises the level of poverty in that environment. It raises the level of poverty in that environment. Now, once this happens, another critical impact on the socioeconomic and livelihood impacts that we must take note of is food insecurity. Food insecurity arises. That means the food chain, the food supply of that particular society becomes insecure. The assurance that there will be food, there will be enough food flow over a period of time, and the possibility of famine will not be there, is not very secure. So food insecurity, becomes a very serious issue. They now have to be looking for ways of importing food from other regions of the country in order to secure their food supply. This is a very critical issue. Now, what about sociocultural impacts? Number 4, a loss of cultural heritage. Degradation of land and waterways, is severe communication from their cultural and spiritual roots. Africans are very rooted in the land, very, very rooted in the land. And whenever the land is damaged, it affects the cultural connection and also the spiritual connection of Africans to the land. This is very critical. It is very critical to a unity and cultural cohesion of a group of people. And usually when this is absent, it can lead to other forms of degenerative effect on the society, that eventually affects conflict, so on and so forth. We're going to look at conflict. We're going to look at conflict. Social unrest and conflict. Social unrest and conflict. That results. Now, we've heard, stories about the Ogoni Pensarowiwa because of his, his activism, with reference to Ogoniland. The oil spillage and destruction of Ogoniland, the environment in Ogoniland led, to these people, protesting. And it's unfortunate that, he was killed along with other members of the Ogoni society by the military government. for fighting for this society. But you can see that as a consequence, when we're looking at social-cultural impacts or political impact, so to speak, as a consequence of these various forms of degradation and destruction of the environment, a social unrest has risen that has, graduated into conflicts, and we see all the Niger Delta groups that are fighting. Uh, their whole logic for fighting emanates from this: the destruction of their livelihood, their land, their society by all of these impacts factors that we've mentioned. Now, all of this has created conflicts, and over the years, the fighting that has been taking place in the Niger Delta has not ameliorated, the situation. Rather, it has complicated the situation. We can see it as a factor, as an impact that has further destroyed the environment. The engagement of the Niger Delta youth, MEND, MOSOP, all these groups that have been fighting, for the betterment of the Niger Delta, although they are fighting a good cause, but their engagement in this conflict has, further, deteriorated the security environment and also other forms of social cohesion that would have made the place, a very good place to stay. So, social cultural impacts are critical. Social cultural impacts are critical to look at when we're looking at the impacts of all of these factors on the Niger Delta. Now, what about the broader economic and infrastructural impact? Brothers, infrastructural impact on the Niger Delta is really, really enormous, because the financial cost of cleaning up regions, for instance, like the Ogoni region, for instance, is massive. The amount of money that will be needed to clean up, all the oil spills and so on and so forth is very, 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 heavy. It's very heavy. Now, the damage to infrastructure also has to be factored in. Pipeline corrosion, sabotage, spillage, this has led to a loss of tourism potential in the Niger Delta, because this is a very beautiful area that has a lot of pristine beaches, mangrove, wildlife, a very good place that is good for, has good potential for eco tourism. But all of this is lost. So it affects the broader economic outlook of the Niger Delta. It affects, because with all these problems, investment, foreign investment, even local investment in tourism is lacking. And because of the safety, both in person and health and food safety, there's no security in health, food, and person. It makes it difficult for people to gravitate towards the Niger Delta for infrastructural investment, other forms of economic investment. So these forms of impact are very critical to note, that these are the things that are really affecting the Niger Delta. Now, I want us to pay attention, students, pay attention to all of this that have been discussed in this class, because this particular question, though is the final in the course outline, this topic is going to come out as questions in the exam. So you need to go through this lecture over and over again in order to be able to, properly, answer those questions that I'm going to raise with reference to, this particular topic. God bless you. Have a very Merry Christmas. Okay.